The last thing I remember with any clarity is the rhythmic, hypnotic thrum of the windshield wipers, slicing through the heavy coastal rain. I was sitting in the back of an armored Mercedes SUV, the leather cool against my skin. Carlo, my constant shadow, since I was 16, sat in the passenger seat. His posture was rigid, his eyes constantly darting to the side mirrors. The tension in the car was thick enough to choke on, but that was just Tuesday in my world. "Visibility is garbage," Carlo muttered, his hand resting instinctively on the breast of his tailored suit, right where his holster sat. I didn't answer. I was staring out at the blurred city lights, tracing a drop of water as it crawled down the reinforced glass. Then the world exploded. It wasn't a sound so much as a physical force that ruptured the air. The massive SUV was suddenly airborne, lifting off the slick asphalt with a sickening lurch. My head slammed against the side window. The glass didn't shatter. It spiderwebbed, glowing briefly in the headlights of the truck that had just T-boned us at 70 miles an hour. Gravity inverted. We flipped multiple times, metal shrieking as it tore. When we finally crashed down into the embankment, the silence that followed was heavy and ringing. I blinked, warm blood dripping into my eyes. My chest felt tight, bound by the seatbelt that had likely kept my neck from snapping. "Carlo," I wheezed, the word tasting like copper. I turned my head. Carlo was slumped sideways, his neck resting at an impossible angle. A dark, terrifying pool was already spreading across the center console. He was gone. Footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. Heavy boots, muffled voices cutting through the downpour. My vision began to swim. My body felt heavy, but deep within my muscle fibers, a strange, electric coil of instinct tightened. My hand, seemingly with a mind of its own, reached down to the concealed holster strapped to my thigh. My fingers brushed the cold steel of my Glock 19. The rear passenger door was pried open with a violent screech of tearing metal. A masked face leaned in, holding a flashlight that blinded me. Before I could raise the weapon, a heavy boot connected with the side of my head. The white light flared into a blinding supernova, and then, mercifully, everything faded to black. Don Ennio Rinaldi stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate's private medical wing. He was watching the storm rage over the ocean. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture radiating quiet menace. Marco stood a few feet away, nursing a glass of scotch, watching the private physician, Dr. Rossi, step out of the recovery room. The doctor was sweating, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. "Well?" Don Rinaldi asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that didn't require him to turn around. "She is stable, Don Rinaldi," Dr. Rossi said, his voice trembling slightly. "The rib fractures are clean, and the lacerations are stitched. However, the blunt force trauma to her skull was severe." Marco stepped forward, his interest piqued. "Is she brain dead? If she's a vegetable, her father won't trade the port territories for her." No, nothing like that," the doctor rushed to clarify. "She is conscious, but neurologically, she is experiencing total amnesia. The trauma, combined with the psychological shock of the crash, has wiped the slate clean. She doesn't know her name, her family, or where she is. It is a complete dissociative state." Silence stretched across the room, broken only by the rain lashing against the glass. Slowly, Don Rinaldi turned from the window. A slow, chilling smile spread across his weathered face. He looked at Marco, the unspoken strategy passing between them in an instant. A hostage who fought back was a liability. A hostage who didn't know she was a hostage was a masterpiece. "Marco," the Don said softly, "it appears your lovely wife has finally woken up from her tragic riding accident. Go and comfort her," Marco grinned, downing the rest of his scotch. "Of course, Father. I'll make sure she feels right at home." I woke to the smell of lavender and bleach. My eyelids felt like sandpaper. When I finally forced them open, the light was agonizingly bright. I squeezed my eyes shut, taking a slow, shallow breath. My ribs screamed in protest. "Easy now. Take it slow." The voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely unfamiliar. I opened my eyes again, letting them adjust. I was lying in a massive four-poster bed with pristine white linens. The room was sprawling, decorated in rich mahogany and cream, silk. Sitting in an armchair beside the bed was a man. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, but there was a sharpness to his jawline and a coldness in his dark eyes that made my heart give a sudden, inexplicable thump of warning. I tried to speak, but my throat was painfully dry. "Who?" I swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The man stood, pouring a glass of water from a crystal pitcher on the bedside table. He helped me sit up, pressing the glass to my lips. His touch was gentle, but my skin crawled beneath it. "My name is Marco," he said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. He reached out, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. "And you are Sofia. You're safe now, my love." I stared at him, my mind spinning its wheels in deep mud. "Sofia," I repeated. The name felt hollow. It didn't anchor to anything. I looked around the room, desperate for a photograph, a familiar object, anything to spark a flame in the dark void of my mind. There was nothing. "What happened to me?" I whispered, panic beginning to tighten my chest. I can't remember anything. I don't know who I am." Marco's face fell into an expression of profound sorrow. He took my hand in his. "You had a terrible accident, Sofia. You were thrown from your horse at the edge of the estate. You hit your head very hard. The doctor said you might experience some memory loss, but to completely forget..." He shook his head, looking heartbroken. I looked down at our joined hands. He was wearing a heavy gold ring. "Are we?" "We've been married for 2 years, Marco said smoothly. I pulled my hand away, masking the movement by reaching up to touch the thick bandage wrapped around my forehead. I was his wife. I lived here. This was my life. Yet, as a maid quietly entered the room, draping a beautiful pastel green dress over the back of a chaise lounge for when I was ready to leave the bed, I felt no comfort. When Marco looked at me, I didn't feel the warmth of a husband's love. My muscles tensed, naturally shifting my weight beneath the blankets, coiling like a spring ready to snap. I had no memory of my life, but as Marco smiled at me, a silent, primal voice in my head whispered a single terrifying command: "Do not trust him."
The heavy leather punching bag groaned under the rhythm of my strikes. Jab, cross, hook. The basement gym of the Valentino compound was silent, except for the harsh exhalations of my breath and the crack of my taped knuckles against the leather. I preferred it down here. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and iron, a stark contrast to the cloying scent of imported lilies and polished marble upstairs. Upstairs was for politics. Down here was for survival. I delivered a brutal roundhouse kick that sent the bag swinging wildly on its heavy steel chains. Before it could swing back, the heavy reinforced door of the gym creaked open. I didn't turn around. I simply caught the swinging bag with one hand, killing its momentum instantly. "I told the guards no interruptions, Luca," I said, my voice low. "It's not the guards, capo." Luca's voice was tight, stripped of its usual easy swagger. "It's the... Don, he wants you in his study 5 minutes ago." I finally turned. Luca was pale. His hand was resting on the butt of his gun, but not out of aggression, out of a nervous, subconscious need for a tether. The atmosphere in the compound had suddenly shifted. Even down in the basement, I could feel the change in barometric pressure. The compound was locking down. "What happened?" I asked, unwrapping the athletic tape from my hands with practiced methodical movements. "They found the princess's transport on Route 9. Luca swallowed hard. "It's a mess, Antonio. A total wipeout." My jaw clenched. Sofia. My mind instantly flashed to the last time I had seen the Don's pampered daughter. It had been 3 days ago, in the courtyard. She had been wearing designer sunglasses that probably cost more than my first car snapping her fingers at a maid. I had walked past, refusing to yield the paved path, forcing her to step onto the grass. She had looked at me as if I were a cockroach that had crawled out of the drain. I had looked back at her with the exact same sentiment, To me, Sofia Valentino was everything wrong with the new generation of the family. She was soft, entitled, and entirely ignorant of the blood that paid for her silk sheets. She was a liability in stilettos, but she was the boss's daughter. And my loyalty to the Don was absolute. I threw my towel onto a bench and grabbed my shirt. Carlo? Dead, Luca said grimly. Neck snapped in the crash. But Sofia wasn't in the wreckage. The air in Don Valentino's private study was thick with cigar smoke and a palpable vibrating fury. When I walked in, 5 of the family's top lieutenants were standing around the massive oak desk, speaking in hushed, frantic tones. But my eyes immediately found that Don Vincenzo Valentino was a mountain of a man who usually commanded a room with nothing more than a whisper. Today he looked older. The deep lines framing his mouth were carved into stone. On the desk in front of him sat a twisted, bloody piece of metal, the customized hood ornament from Sofia's armored SUV. The Don raised his hand, a single, sharp gesture. The room instantly fell dead silent. He looked up at me. Antonio. The Don's voice was dangerously calm, the terrifying quiet before a hurricane makes landfall. My daughter has been taken. I stepped forward, keeping my posture perfectly neutral. Do we know who hit them? The Don slid a sleek black burner phone across the polished wood of the desk. Ennio Rinaldi called 20 minutes ago. His men ran Sofia's detail off the road. He has her at one of his secure locations. The Rinaldi family. Of course. They had been pushing against our northern borders for months, testing the waters, trying to see if the Valentino lion was losing its teeth. Taking the Don's only child wasn't just a provocation, it was a declaration of all-out war. What are his terms? I asked. He wants the east side ports, one of the lieutenants, a hothead named Silvio, spat. Half of our maritime smuggling routes. The old bastard wants to cut off our oxygen, and he's using the girl to do it. I kept my face impassive, though internally. My mind was racing. Giving up the east side ports would cripple the Valentino empire. It would be a slow bleeding death. But refusing meant Sofia would likely be mailed back to us in a series of very small boxes. I looked at the Don. Boss, give me the word and I'll take a crew to the Rinaldi borders right now. We start taking heads until they hand her over. Don Valentino slowly shook his head. He stood up, walking over to the heavy velvet drapes and looking out over the manicured grounds of the estate. No, the Don said softly. Ennio is a snake, but he isn't stupid. If we start a street war, he'll panic. He'll put a bullet in her and dump her in the river just to spite us. The Don turned back to face me, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that burned. Rinaldi thinks he holds a fragile little bird. He thinks he can use my love for her to break me. A strange, almost imperceptible pride flickered in the Don's eyes, confusing me for a fraction of a second. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by cold, hard resolve. I need a scalpel, Antonio, not a sledgehammer. I need my best enforcer. The Don walked around the desk, stopping mere inches from me. You will assemble a team, only the best. Only men you trust with your own life. You will find where that bastard is hiding my daughter, and you will bring her back. Understood, boss. And Antonio. The Don's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. When you find the men who put their hands on her, do not make it quick. They'll beg for hell before I'm done with them, I promised. As I turned to leave the study, my mind was already shifting into tactical mode, compartmentalizing the mission. I needed satellite imagery. Informants squeezed, an armory's worth of C4. But beneath the cold calculation, a sliver of bitter resentment gnawed at me. I was going to risk my life and the lives of my best men for a spoiled princess who probably tripped over her own Gucci bags during the ambush. I pictured her cowering in a corner crying completely useless. Just a job, I reminded myself, walking down the ornate hallway toward the armory. Retrieve the princess.
The pastel green dress the maid had left for me was spun from heavy, expensive silk. It fit my frame perfectly, sliding over the faint bruises on my ribs like a second skin. I stood in front of the ornate vanity mirror in the attached bathroom, staring at the stranger looking back at me. I had dark, heavy hair that tumbled past my shoulders, pale skin and dark eyes that looked exhausted and hollow. I reached up, tracing the line of my jaw, then touched the crisp white bandage wrapped around my forehead. Sofia Rinaldi. I mouthed the name to the mirror. It felt like ash on my tongue. It wasn't just that the name meant nothing to me. It felt fundamentally wrong, like wearing a shoe that was 2 sizes too small. I leaned closer to the glass, gripping the edges of the marble sink. My hands. I looked down at them. They were manicured, the nails painted a soft, neutral color, but as I turned them over, the illusion broke. Calluses. Thick, hardened ridges of skin sat just below my knuckles, and lighter, older calluses lined the pads of my palms. These were not the hands of a woman who spent her days riding horses and attending charity galas. The calluses didn't make sense. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady the frantic beating of my heart. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know the handsome man claiming to be my husband. But the visceral, vibrating hum of danger in my gut was undeniable. Every instinct I possessed. Instincts carved so deeply into my muscle memory that not even a severe brain injury could erase them, was screaming at me that I was in enemy territory. If I panicked, I would be a victim. If I fought back, now blind and isolated in a massive house, full of armed men, I would likely be killed. Even if I did manage to get free, where would I go? I had to be smart. I had to be the fragile, broken wife they told me I was. I needed to play the game until I learned the rules. I smoothed down the silk of my dress, pinned a hesitant, vulnerable smile on my face, and opened the bathroom door to step back into the master suite. The room was vast, bathed in the soft light of morning. On the far wall, a massive flat-screen television hung flush against the expensive wallpaper. It was cleverly designed to mimic a piece of canvas art, completely devoid of an outer frame border so that the image stretched edge to edge. It was currently playing a long-form ambient soundscape. A looping high-resolution video of a misty forest with the gentle rhythmic audio of rain hitting leaves, meant to be a relaxation aid. Marco was sitting at a small table near the balcony doors, a silver breakfast tray laid out before him. He stood immediately as I entered, his eyes sweeping over me with a possessive gleam that made my stomach turn. "You look breathtaking, Sofia," he said, pulling out a chair for me. "Thank you," I murmured, keeping my voice soft, letting a tremor of uncertainty bleed into my tone. I sat down, keeping my hands folded in my lap so he wouldn't notice the calluses. "I still feel very lost." "That is to be expected," Marco soothed, pouring me a cup of tea. "Dr. Rossi said it will take time. You just need rest and quiet." Before I could take a sip, the heavy bedroom door opened. A man walked in, flanked by 2 massive guards who looked more like linebackers than household staff. The older man had silver hair swept back from a deeply lined face. His eyes were the color of slate, and they locked onto me with a cold, calculating wait. This was a man used to absolute obedience. "Ah, Sofia," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly purr. He approached the table, dismissing the guards to the hallway with a flick of his wrist. "It warms an old man's heart to see you sitting up. How are you feeling, my dear?" "Sofia," Marco said gently, placing a hand over mine. "This is my father, Ennio. Your father-in-law. Ennio." I committed the name to memory. I looked up at him, widening my eyes slightly, channeling every ounce of fear I felt into a mask of pure innocence. "It is nice to meet you again," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I wish I could remember you." Ennio's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a predator's smile. "Do not apologize, my child. The accident was a tragedy. But you are here safe in our family's embrace. That is all that matters." He reached out and patted my shoulder. His hand was heavy. The sheer willpower it took for me not to grab his wrist, twist his arm behind his back, and shatter his elbow was staggering. The urge to neutralize the threat standing over me flared so brightly my vision practically swam, but I forced my muscles to remain entirely slack. I forced myself to lean into his touch like a frightened bird seeking shelter. "Thank you, Ennio," I breathed. "Marco will take excellent care of you," Ennio said, stepping back, clearly satisfied with my docility. "We are keeping you secluded in this wing for your own good. The doctors insist on zero stress. No visitors, no phone calls, no outside media. Just rest." "Of course," I nodded obediently. "I will leave you to your breakfast," Ennio said, turning toward the door. He exchanged a brief, entirely unreadable look with Marco before slipping out of the room. The lock on the door clicked shut with a heavy metallic finality. Locked in my mind, supplied clinically. "Eat," Marco urged, buttering a piece of toast for me. "You need your strength." I pretended to sip the tea, secretly crumbling the toasted into my napkin when Marco looked away to check his watch. I couldn't risk being drugged, and I couldn't afford to be sluggish. As Marco talked, filling the silence with fabricated stories of our supposed life together, I nodded along, offering shy smiles at the appropriate moments. But behind my wide, vacant eyes I was working. I cataloged the heavy brass candlestick on the dresser, a perfect bludgeoning tool. I noted the drop from the balcony was 3 stories onto manicured grass, survivable with a proper roll, but dangerous with fractured ribs. I counted the seconds it took for the guards' heavy boots to pass by the door in the hallway. Apatrol rotation every 4 minutes. They thought I was a blank slate. They thought my mind was broken and my spirit was tame. I pretended to sip my tea, looking at Marco through my eyelashes. Let them think I was a helpless princess. The longer they underestimated me, the more time I had to sharpen the knives in the arc. Let them keep thinking I was helpless. The longer they underestimated me, more time I had to figure a way out of this place and figure out who I was.
The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. It hammered against the corrugated steel roof of the dockside warehouse, a relentless drumming rhythm that did nothing to mask the sound of a man weeping. I stood in the shadows near a stack of wooden shipping, crates, the air heavy with the smell of brine-wet concrete and fear. In the center of the dimly lit space, bound to a heavy metal chair with zip ties, was a man named Arturo. He was a mid-level capo for Ennio, someone who managed the logistics for the Rinaldi family's private properties. If anyone knew where Ennio had stashed the princess, it was him. Luca, my second-in-command, stood next to the chair, slowly tapping a solid steel wrench against his palm. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. I stepped out of the shadows, my boots making no sound on the damp concrete. I pulled up a wooden crate and sat down directly in front of Arturo. He flinched, his eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on my face. Everyone on the streets knew who I was, Vincenzo's attack dog, Vincenzo's personal enforcer. Arturo. I said, my voice barely carrying over the sound of the rain. "I am a man who values his time, and right now you are wasting it. I swear, on my mother's grave, Antonio, I don't know anything about the girl." Arturo sobbed, straining against the plastic ties cutting into his wrists. "Ennio keeps that inner circle tight. I just moved the money for the contractors." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my thighs. I studied him closely, the sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill in the warehouse, the rapid, shallow rise and fall of his chest. He was terrified, but he was also lying. "Contractors," I repeated softly. "That's interesting, because my intel says Ennio recently pulled his best men off the street. His private guard. He's concentrated them somewhere. A man like Ennio doesn't pull his shield back unless he's protecting something incredibly valuable." I reached into my leather jacket and pulled out a silver custom-engraved lighter, a gift from Vincenzo a decade ago. I flipped the lid open with a sharp clink. A small, perfectly controlled flame illuminated the space between us. I snapped it shut. Clink. "I'm going to ask you one more time, Arturo. Where is she?" Clink. The flame appeared. Clink. Darkness. Arturo swallowed hard, his eyes tracking the silver metal in my hand. "If I tell you, Ennio will kill me. He'll skin me alive." "If you don't tell me," I replied, my voice devoid of any emotion, "I won't even give you the courtesy of taking off your skin first." I gave him time. The silence stretched taut as piano wire. Then he broke. "The coastal estate." Arturo gasped, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The one built into the cliffs near Blackwood Point. It has a private medical wing. Ennio had a team of specialists brought in 3 days ago. That's all I know, I swear to God. I stood up, sliding the lighter back into my pocket. Blackwood Point. It was a fortress. The estate sat on a jagged peninsula surrounded by the ocean on 3 sides, with only one heavily fortified road leading in. It was a nightmare to breach. Put him to sleep, I told Luca, turning on my heels and walking toward the reinforced steel door of the warehouse. And get the team ready. We roll out at midnight. As I stepped out into the freezing downpour, the cold water soaking through my dark hair, the reality of the mission settled heavily on my shoulders. I walked to my parked SUV and pulled out a waterproof tactical map from the trunk, spreading it over the hood under the dull orange glow of a streetlight. My finger traced the single winding road leading to Blackwood Point. My jaw tightened until my teeth ached. We were walking into an ambush. I was risking Luca, Marco, and 6 of my best operators, men who had bled for me, men who had kept me alive in firefights, to save a girl who had likely spent her entire captivity crying in a corner waiting to be rescued. I pictured Sofia as I had last seen her. Draped in expensive clothes, her nose turned up at the world, a fragile porcelain doll completely ignorant of the violence that maintained her lifestyle. I imagined her sitting in one of Ennio's luxurious bedrooms right now, completely useless, giving the enemy every bit of leverage they needed to tear her father's empire apart. Resentment burned hot and bitter in my chest, a stark contrast to the freezing rain. Vincenzo was a brilliant strategist, a don who built an empire from dust. I loved the man like a father, but his blind spot for his daughter was going to get my men killed. I slammed my fist onto the hood of the SUV, the sound echoing sharply in the empty alley. I had to suppress the anger. Anger made you sloppy. Anger got you shot. I needed to be cold. I needed to be the machine Vincenzo knew me to be. I pulled out my phone and dialed the encrypted channel for the strike team. Listen up, I barked into the receiver, the rain continuing to wash over me. We have the location, Blackwood Point. It's a hard target, heavily fortified. I pulled out my phone and dialed the encrypted channel for the strike team. Listen. Up. I barked into the receiver, the freezing rain continuing to wash over me. We have the location, Blackwood Point. It's a hard target, heavily fortified. I traced my thumb along the topographical lines of the waterproof map, my mind locking into the tactical geometry of the estate. A single approach would be suicide. Ennio would have the main road locked down tight. We needed to fracture their attention. We are splitting the squad into 2 units to squeeze the perimeter. I continued, my voice cold and methodical over the roar of the storm. Alpha Team, you take the land approach. You'll drop vehicles 3 miles out and move on foot through the dense pine forest, hugging the eastern ridgeline. The canopy will hide you from aerial thermal and the storm will cover your noise. Your job is to neutralize the perimeter handlers and clear the tree line before they can sound an alarm. I want a sniper overwatch established on that ridge. Copy. On that. Marco's voice crackled back through the secure channel. Bravo Team, you're with me, I said, tracing the jagged blue line representing the treacherous ocean surrounding the peninsula. We take the sea approach. We drop from the Zodiacs. A half-mile offshore, use the rebreathers and dive under the breakers. We come up the private beach in the dark. The surf is going to be impossible tonight, Antonio. Luca chimed in, though there was no hesitation in his tone, which is exactly why their coastal sentries won't be looking closely at the water. Countered. We use the tide to mask our landing, breach the seawall, and bypass the main security gate entirely. Alpha provides the distraction and containment. Bravo slips inside and extracts the package. Understood, Luca affirmed. If anyone gets between you and the girl, you put them in the ground. I ordered, my eyes fixed on the blueprint of the estate. Nobody hesitates. We're on it, Marco replied. Gear up. I said, folding the map and shoving it into the interior pocket of my tactical vest. Tonight we take the princess out of the tower, and we burn the tower down. The heavy oak doors of the master suite were just 20 yards away, but the hallway was a bottleneck of chaos. The blare of the estate's security alarm was deafening, a high-pitched rhythmic wail that meant our window for a quiet extraction had slammed shut. I moved with lethal purpose, my suppressed rifle tucked tightly to my shoulder. A Rinaldi guard stepped out from an intersecting corridor, submachine gun raising. I didn't break stride. 2 suppressed shots thwipped through the air, taking him in the chest before his finger even found the trigger. I stepped over his body, my eyes fixed on the master suite. From inside the room, a muffled, frantic struggle echoed even over the alarm. A heavy thud against the wall, a sharp cry of pain. My blood ran cold. If they killed the Don's leverage, before I could get her out, Vincenzo would burn this entire coast to the ground, and I would be the first one in the fire. I didn't bother checking the handle. I planted my back foot and drove my boot directly into the locking mechanism with the force of a battering ram. The wood splintered with a deafening crack, the massive door flying inward and smashing against the interior wall. I swept into the room, sweeping the barrel of my rifle left to right, expecting a firing squad. What I saw made my brain misfire. Marco Rinaldi was backed against the balcony glass, his face pale and eyes wide with pure shock. In the center of the room, one massive guard was on his knees, clutching a ruined, bleeding nose. The second guard, a man built like a tank, was in the middle of lunging. I raised my rifle, tracking the second guard, but before I could squeeze the trigger, the tank of a man slammed into me. My shot went wide, burying itself in the ceiling plaster as the guard's momentum carried us both backward into a heavy mahogany dresser. The rifle was knocked from my grip, clattering across the floor. The guard was pure muscle and panic. He pinned me against the wood, pulling a serrated combat knife from his belt. He drove it down. I caught his wrist with both hands, my boots scrambling for purchase on the expensive rug as the blade hovered an inch above my throat. I gritted my teeth, preparing to shift my weight and throw him, but suddenly the massive weight on my chest vanished. The guard let out a choked, wet gasp. His grip on the knife evaporated. I watched in absolute disbelief as the man was yanked violently backward. Sofia had stepped behind him. Her face was pale but set in lines of terrifying concentration. She had the heavy brass base of a candlestick, pressed into the back of his knee to break his stance, and her arm was locked tightly around his throat in a flawless textbook blood choke. Within 3 seconds, the massive guard's eyes rolled into the back of his head. He went completely limp. Sofia stepped back, letting the man drop to the floor like a sack of wet cement. Her chest heaved, her dark hair wild, the silk of her pastel green dress stained with the guard's blood. I pushed myself off the dresser, grabbing my rifle from the floor. My heart was hammering against my ribs, an unfamiliar mix of adrenaline and profound confusion flooding my system. I stared at the pampered, haughty Mafia princess I had despised for years, trying to comprehend what I had just witnessed. But we didn't have time for a debrief. Boot falls were thundering up the main staircase. "All right, playtime's over." I barked, my voice rough, turning my weapon toward a terrified Marco. I put a single round through his kneecap. Marco screamed, collapsing to the floor and clutching his shattered leg. I didn't give him a second glance. I turned back to Sofia. "Let's move." Sofia didn't move toward me. Instead, she took a calculated step backward, her bare feet silent on the rug. She bent down, keeping her eyes locked onto mine, and smoothly pulled a Glock 19 from the unconscious guard's holster. She racked the slide, checking the chamber, and leveled the barrel directly at my chest. My temper, already running hot from the botched stealth approach, finally snapped. "Put the gun down, Sofia. I don't have time for your tantrums." I snapped, taking a step toward her. "Your father didn't send me to save you so you could play hard to get. Move your ass right now." Her stance didn't waver. Her finger hovered just outside the trigger guard, a discipline that infuriated me even more because it made absolutely no sense. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she stated, her voice shaking, but laced with cold steel. "Damn it, Sofia, this isn't a game!" I roared, the frustration boiling over. "Half of Ennio's private army is running up those stairs right now. I am not leaving here without you, so unless you want to get us both killed because of your stubborn pride, you will put that weapon down and get behind me." She stared at me, the weapon perfectly steady. The defiance in her eyes wasn't the spoiled arrogance I was used to. It was the feral, cornered look of a survivor. "Who are you?" she demanded. I let out a harsh, sarcastic laugh. Oh, we're doing this? We're pretending we don't know each other? I'm Antonio, your father's enforcer. The guy you treat like a stray dog on a daily basis. Now, did Marco send you to test me? She cut me off, her eyes darting frantically between me and the bleeding man on the floor. I froze. The genuine, raw confusion in her voice finally broke through my anger. I looked closely at her face. There was a thick white bandage wrapped around her temple. The absolute absence of recognition in her dark eyes was chilling. Sofia, I said, slowly lowering the barrel of my rifle slightly. It's me, Antonio Silva. Your father, Vincenzo Valentino, sent me to get you back. She blinked, the name Vincenzo clearly meaning absolutely nothing to her. She looked down at the gun in her hand, then back up at me. I don't know who Vincenzo is, she whispered, the lethal confidence cracking just a fraction. I don't know who I am. The floor dropped out from under my stomach. Memory loss? It was the only explanation that fit. The crash, the bandages, the fact that Ennio had hidden her in a medical wing rather than a dungeon. You don't remember anything? I asked, my voice dropping to a low, quiet intensity. No, she said, her chest rising and falling rapidly. But I know Marco just tried to drag me to a basement, and I know how to use this. She tightened her grip. On the Glock. Yeah, I can see that, I murmured. The pieces were falling into place. Vincenzo hadn't just pampered his daughter. He had forged a weapon in secret and kept it hidden from everyone, even me. Listen to me very carefully, I said, my voice completely devoid of the anger from seconds before. I held out my free hand, palm open. You are a Valentino. You were kidnapped. I know you don't trust me, and right now you shouldn't trust anyone. But if you stay here, more of those guards are going to come through that door, and they will kill you. Come with me, and I will get you out of this house.
My head was pounding a vicious rhythmic throb that matched the wailing of the alarms. The man standing in front of me, Antonio, was soaked in freezing rain and covered in the dark tactical gear of an assassin. He was terrifying. But as he looked at me, the anger that had contorted his face a moment ago had vanished, replaced by a sharp, calculating clarity. He didn't look at me like Marco did. Marco looked at me like a possession. Antonio looked at me like a problem he had to solve. Strangely, that felt infinitely safer. I glanced at the doorway. I could hear them coming, heavy boots on marble, shouting. I looked back at Antonio. I didn't lower the gun, but I stepped to the side, giving him a clear path to the door. Lead the way, I commanded. He gave a sharp single nod. Stay behind me. We're going down the main stairs to the terrace. He spun toward the splintered doorway, just as two Rinaldi guards rounded the corner. Antonio didn't hesitate. He dropped the first one with a double tap to the chest. Before he could track the second, my body moved on its own. I stepped out from behind him, leveled the Glock, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil jolted through my arms, a familiar, comforting shock. The second guard's head snapped back, his weapon clattering to the floor as he crumpled. Antonio whipped his head around, staring at the smoking gun in my hands, his jaw tight. Move, I said, stepping past him into the hallway. You're supposed to stay behind me. He grunted, rushing to take the point position again. You were moving too slow. I retorted, my eyes sweeping the corridor for new targets. He let out a low curse in Italian, his earpiece crackling wildly as we moved toward the grand staircase. Below us, the foyer was swarming with armed men. The stealth mission was dead. Now it was just a war. And to my absolute horror, as we plunged into the firefight, I realized I was perfectly at home in the crossfire. The grand staircase curved downward, offering a perfect sweeping view of the foyer. It also made us sitting ducks.
Below us, the massive entrance hall had become a killing floor. 4 of Ennio's enforcers had taken up fortified positions behind thick marble pillars, laying down a relentless wall of suppressive fire with submachine guns. Chunks of plaster and marble rained down around us as bullets chewed the balustrade to pieces. I threw myself flat against the landing, yanking Sofia down by her shoulder, just as a spray of 9mm rounds shattered the wall where her head had been a second before. Keep your head down, I roared over the deafening clatter of gunfire. My earpiece was practically screaming. Antonio, Luca yelled, the sound of heavy automatic fire echoing through his mic. Alpha team is fully engaged on the perimeter. They've got a dozen guys rushing the eastern lawn. We are pinned at the seawall. If you don't break out right now, they're going to box you in. Hold the line, Luca, we're coming. I barked back, though I had no idea how. I popped up over the balustrade, firing controlled, disciplined bursts from my rifle to force the guards behind their pillars. But it was useless. From our elevated angle, the marble columns provided them with impenetrable cover. If we tried to rush down the remaining stairs, they would cut us in half before we reached the bottom. I ducked back down as return fire tore a chunk of the mahogany banister into splinters. We're trapped. I gritted my teeth, dropping an empty magazine and slamming a fresh one home. I can't get a clean angle on them. You don't need an angle on the men, a cold, calm voice said right beside me. I turned. Sofia was crouched on one knee, her face completely drained of color, but her dark eyes sharp and utterly terrifying in their focus. She wasn't looking at the guards. She was looking straight up at the vaulted ceiling, suspended directly over the center of the foyer. Directly above the marble pillars was a massive three-tiered crystal chandelier. It was heavy enough to crush a truck, held in place by a thick steel mounting bracket and a heavy chain. Cover me, Sofia commanded. Are you insane? You step out there, they'll turn you into Swiss cheese, I yelled. I need 3 seconds, Antonio. Give them to me. Before I could grab her, she moved. She didn't just step out. She slid into the open with fluid, practiced grace, dropping into a perfect kneeling weaver stance. I didn't have time to argue. I vaulted up, leaning completely over the balustrade and holding the trigger down, spraying the pillars with a furious barrage of lead that forced all 4 guards to duck for their lives. 1. Sofia raised the Glock. She didn't aim down at the foyer. She aimed at the ceiling. 2. She fired 3 rapid shots. Sparks exploded like fireworks near the ceiling as her rounds found the brass mounting bracket. 3. With a terrifying metallic groan that resonated through the entire house, the bracket snapped. Hundreds of pounds of crystal brass and heavy steel chain plummeted 40 feet. It hit the marble floor of the foyer with the concussive force of a bomb. Go! Sofia yelled, already up and moving. I was dumbstruck for a fraction of a second, but survival instinct took over. I vaulted down the remaining steps, my boots crunching. Over the carpet of broken glass. The foyer was a ruin. The 2 remaining guards were disoriented, completely neutralized by the blast. I kicked the shattered remains of the terrace doors open, bursting out into the freezing, driving rain.
The cold hit me like a physical blow. The wind whipped in off the ocean, carrying sheets of freezing rain that instantly soaked through the silk of my dress, dragging at my limbs like lead weights. Antonio didn't slow down. He grabbed my wrist, pulling me across the manicured lawn toward a low stone wall at the edge of the property. Behind us, the alarms of the estate wailed a chaotic symphony, mixed with the distant, frantic popping of gunfire from the surrounding woods. Luca. We have the package. Fall back to the water. Antonio roared into his radio. We scrambled over the seawall, sliding down the treacherous, rain-slicked rocks toward the crashing surf below. The darkness here was absolute, save for the green luminescent glow of the gear worn by 3 men emerging from the shadows of the beach. They laid down, covering fire over our heads, aiming up at the estate's terrace as more flashlights began to pour out of the shattered glass doors. The icy surf crashed against my calves as we hit the sand. 2 black, rigid-hulled inflatable boats were waiting, bobbing violently in the churning waves, their outboard engines idling with a low, predatory growl. "Get in!" Antonio yelled, practically lifting me over the rubber siding of the Zodiac. Tumbled into the center of the boat, my fractured ribs screaming in protest as I hit the deck. Antonio climbed in right behind me, shouting orders to the driver. The engine roared the propeller, biting into the water and throwing us violently backward against our seats as the boat launched into the massive dark swells of the open ocean. I grabbed onto the safety rope, my knuckles turning white. As we pulled away from the shore, I looked back. Blackwood Point was a fortress illuminated by the flashing lights of a failing empire. Tracer rounds lit up the night sky over the forest ridge as Antonio's distraction team fought their way out. We plunged into the ink-black darkness of the ocean, the storm swallowing us whole, leaving the chaos behind. The adrenaline that had sustained me for the last 20 minutes finally began to crash. I started shivering violently, my teeth chattering, as the freezing rain lashed against my skin. I huddled into myself, pulling my knees to my chest. Someone threw a heavy waterproof tactical jacket over my shoulders. It smelled of sea salt and gun oil. I looked up. Antonio was sitting across from me, the bouncing of the boat forcing him to brace his boots against the deck. The harsh green light from the boat's navigation instruments illuminated his face. He wasn't looking out at the water. He was looking directly at me. His eyes were searching, calculating, trying to dissect the woman sitting in front of him. I tightened the jacket around my shoulders, my right hand still gripping the stolen Glock, 19 beneath the folds of the heavy fabric. I had escaped Marco. I had survived the estate. But as I stared at the lethal dark-haired enforcer who had just slaughtered a small army to claim me, I felt a new kind of terror settle into my bones. I didn't know if I had just won my freedom or if I had simply been transferred to a different cage. You're bleeding, Antonio said, his voice barely carrying over the roar of the boat's engine. He pointed to my arm where a deep scratch from the chandelier glass was welling with blood. I looked down at it, feeling no pain. It's fine. When we get to the safe house, the medic will look at it, he said firmly. I met his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to show him how deeply terrified I was of the empty void inside my own head. You said you were my father's enforcer. I said, my voice steady despite the violent shivering of my body. You said we knew each other. Antonio let out a dark, breathless sound that might have been a laugh if there was any humor in it. Yeah. We knew each other. I tilted my head, studying the hard lines of his jaw and the cold efficiency in his eyes. Did we know each other? The silence stretched between us, filled only by the violent crashing of the waves against the hull. Antonio stared at me, the memory of the spoiled, arrogant princess clashing violently with the image of the lethal survivor currently wearing his jacket. No. Antonio finally answered, his voice dropping to a low rumble that cut straight through the noise of the storm. We hated each other. You thought I was an asshole, and I thought you were a useless brat. I let out a small, shaky breath. A smirk played on my lips, entirely unbidden. Well, Antonio, I murmured, resting my hand on the cold steel of the gun in my lap. It seems you were wrong. Antonio didn't blink. The tension that crackled between us in the cramped boat suddenly shifted, mutating into something entirely unfamiliar and far more dangerous. Yeah. Antonio muttered, his eyes never leaving mine. It seems I was.
The Zodiac pounded against the massive swells for what felt like hours, the freezing rain stinging my face like buckshot. I navigated us northward, hugging the treacherous coastline, where radar struggled to penetrate the jagged cliffs. By the time the hidden inlet finally materialized through the storm, the men were shivering and exhausted. I steered the boat into a narrow channel cut deep into the rock face. The violent crashing of the ocean instantly muted as we passed beneath a natural stone archway gliding into a calm subterranean cavern. Hidden inside the cavern was a reinforced steel dock. Above it, carved directly into the bedrock and completely invisible from the land and sea, was the primary Valentino safe house. Luca was waiting on the docks, flanked by 2 armed guards. He tossed a heavy mooring line to our driver as we bumped against the rubber bumpers. Alpha team, I asked, my boots hitting the solid steel of the dock with a heavy thud. Extracted, Luca confirmed, his face grim but relieved. Marco took a graze to the shoulder, but everyone made it to the vehicles. They're laying low at the secondary rally point. Ennio's men are swarming the coastal highways like angry hornets. The roads are a death trap right now. We stay put. Until the heat dies down, I ordered. I turned back to the boat. Sofia was still sitting in the center, wrapped tightly in my oversized tactical jacket. The seawater had plastered her dark hair to her face, and her teeth were chattering violently. She looked small, fragile, and utterly exhausted. But as I reached out a hand to help her onto the dock, her eyes snapped up to mine, and that fragile illusion shattered. Her right hand was still buried deep in the pocket of the jacket gripping the stolen Glock. She didn't take my hand. She stood up on unsteady legs and vaulted over the side of the boat herself, her bare feet hitting the freezing steel. "Let's get inside," I said softly, dropping my hand. We took a freight elevator up 2 levels, stepping out into the main living area of the safe house. It was built for utility, not luxury. Concrete floors, heavy steel blast blinds over the windows, and leather furniture that had seen better days. But it was warm. A massive industrial heater hummed in the corner, pushing glorious dry heat into the room. A silver-haired man holding a trauma kit hurried over as soon as the elevator doors opened. It was Matteo, one of the family's most trusted underground surgeons. Capo. Matteo nodded respectfully to me, then turned his attention to Sofia. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of the blood-stained pastel green silk dress clinging to her beneath the tactical jacket and the deep bleeding gash on her arm. "Signorina Valentino, please sit. Let me look at that arm." Sofia didn't move. She backed up a half step, putting the solid concrete wall behind her back. She didn't say a word, but her posture screamed danger. "It's all right," I told Matteo, stepping between them. I looked at Sofia, keeping my voice low and even. "He's our doctor. He just wants to clean the cut before it gets infected. You can keep the gun." Sofia stared at me for a long, calculating moment. She was processing the environment, reading the exits, calculating Matteo's threat level. Finally, she gave a stiff single nod and walked over to a heavy leather armchair. She sat down, letting the oversized jacket slide off her right shoulder to expose the cut, but she kept her right hand firmly in her lap, the metallic glint of the Glock resting casually against her thigh. I left her with Matteo and walked down the hall to the secure comms room. I needed to make the call I'd been dreading. I picked up the encrypted landline and dialed the private number for Don Vincenzo's study. He picked up on the first ring. "Tell me you have her, Antonio." Vincenzo's voice was a rough, gravelly demand that left no room for failure. "She's safe, boss. We're at the safe house," I reported, rubbing a hand over my exhausted face. "But the extraction went loud. We left a lot of bodies at Blackwood Point. Ennio is going to want blood for this." "Let him try," Vincenzo snarled. "I'll bury every last one of his men. How is she? Did they hurt her?" I hesitated. How was I supposed to explain to the Don that his pampered daughter had snapped a man's neck with her bare hands? How was I supposed to tell him that she didn't know who he was? "She's physically okay." I chose my words carefully. "Some bruises, a cut on her arm, but boss, there's a complication. The crash. She hit her head. She's suffering from severe amnesia. She doesn't remember the family. She doesn't remember you." Silence stretched over the line, heavy and agonizing. When Vincenzo finally spoke, the underlying fury was gone, replaced by a deep, terrifying sorrow. "Does she know what Ennio tried to do to her?" "She figured it out on her own," I said. "She knows we rescued her. But she's on edge, boss. She's completely, entirely lost. We need to keep her here until the highways clear out, maybe until tomorrow night. Keep her safe, Antonio. If a single hair on her head is harmed, I will hold you personally responsible." "With my life, boss." I hung up the phone. I stood in the quiet comms room for a long moment, listening to the muffled howl of the storm against the concrete walls. With my life. That vow had always meant taking bullets. Now it meant something entirely different. It meant protecting a lethal weapon that didn't know her own strength from a world that wanted to use her.
The alcohol swab burned like liquid fire and made me flinch. Matteo worked quickly and silently, stitching the deep laceration on my bicep with practiced precision. I watched his hands tracing the movements, ensuring he wasn't injecting me with anything I hadn't seen him pull directly from an unsealed package. "You have a high tolerance for pain, Signorina," Matteo murmured as he taped a white gauze pad over the neat row of black sutures. "I suppose I do," I replied, my voice hoarse. He packed away his kit and bowed his head slightly. There are clean clothes in the bedroom down the hall to the left. The bathroom has a hot shower. If you feel dizzy or nauseous, you must tell me. Head injuries are unpredictable. Thank you, Matteo. He left the room, leaving me alone in the expansive bunker-like living space. I stood up, my bare feet sinking into a worn rug. The heavy silk of my pastel green dress was completely ruined, stiff with dried seawater, my own blood, and the blood of the men I had choked. It felt like a straitjacket. I found the bedroom Matteo mentioned. It was Spartan, a heavy wooden bed with clean gray sheets, a dresser, and an attached bathroom. I locked the door behind me. I set the Glock carefully on the edge of the sink, right within arm's reach, and turned on the shower. The hot water was a revelation. I stood under the spray for a long time, watching the water turn a rusty pale pink as it washed away the violence of the night. I washed my hair, scrubbing the salt and the smell of gunpowder from my skin, but the hot water couldn't wash away the void in my head. I pressed my forehead against the cool tiles of the shower wall, closing my eyes. I reached into the darkness of my mind, searching desperately for a memory. A childhood birthday. The face of this man they said was my father. The sound of my own laugh. Nothing. There was only a vast, terrifying emptiness. But the moment I stopped, searching for facts, and instead let my mind drift to movement, the void filled with instinct. I knew exactly how much pressure to apply to snap a clavicle. I knew the exact weight and balance of the firearm sitting on the sink. I knew how to map the blind spots in the bunker's security cameras. I wasn't a Mafia princess. And whoever Valentino was, he had built me be able to protect myself. I stepped out of the shower, drying off and putting on the clothes I found on the bed. A pair of simple black sweatpants that were entirely too large and a soft dark gray thermal Henley shirt. I rolled the waistband of the pants down twice so they wouldn't fall and picked up the gun. When I walked back out into the main living area, the bunker was quiet. The other men had cleared out, likely standing guard in the outer corridors. Antonio was standing in the small kitchenette, his back to me. He had taken off his tactical vest and his heavy jacket, leaving him in a black long-sleeved tactical shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders. He was pouring 2 glasses of amber, liquid from a crystal decanter. I walked into the room silently, but he didn't jump. He simply turned around, handing one of the glasses out toward me. "Bourbon," he said. "It'll help with the chill." I hesitated, then took the glass with my left hand. I brought it to my nose, sniffing it discreetly. Antonio let out a low, tired sigh. "It's not poisoned, Sofia. If I wanted you dead, I would have just left you in the master suite with Marco." I met his gaze, taking a slow sip. The bourbon was smooth, burning a pleasant warm trail down my throat. If I stayed in that room with Marco, he would have been the one who needed a medic. I pointed out calmly. A corner of Antonio's mouth twitched, upward in a fleeting, involuntary smirk. He leaned his hip against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest, his dark eyes studying me under the harsh fluorescent lights of the kitchen. "You're right. He would have," Antonio admitted, his voice quiet. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Your father, he kept your talents hidden. The world thought you were a mindless socialite. I thought you were a pampered brat who didn't know how to wash her own dishes, but he was training you." "Why?" I asked, stepping closer, desperate for answers, even if I didn't entirely trust the source. "If he is powerful enough to command men, like you, why turn his daughter into this?" "Because in our world, power makes you a target," Antonio said, his tone turning deadly serious. "Vincenzo has enemies everywhere, Ennio Rinaldi being the loudest. If they knew what you were capable of, they would have sent a hit squad, not a small team. You were his ace in the hole." "My bodyguard?" I recalled the name Marco had mentioned in passing. A flash of memory sparked. A dark, rainy highway, a man slumping sideways with his neck at an impossible angle. My chest tightened with an unexpected, sharp pang of grief for a man I couldn't even put a face to. "He was a good man," Antonio said. "He died trying to protect you." I took another long sip of the bourbon, letting the silence stretch between us. The anger and the adrenaline were finally burning off, leaving me feeling hollowed out and incredibly vulnerable. I hated it. "So what happens now?" I asked, looking up at him. "Do I just go back to playing the princess? Do I go back to a father I don't know and pretend everything is fine?" Antonio pushed off the counter, taking a slow step toward me. The physical presence of the man was overwhelming. He moved with a terrifying grace, a predator perfectly comfortable in his own skin. "I don't know," Antonio answered honestly, stopping just a few feet away. "But you aren't the girl I used to know, Sofia. The girl I knew wouldn't have survived tonight. You did." He reached out his hand, hovering for a second, before his fingers gently brushed a stray, damp piece of hair away from my face. The touch was so unexpected, so starkly different from the brutal violence we had just shared, that my breath hitched in my throat. "Get some sleep." Antonio murmured, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the room feel suddenly dangerously small. "I'll take the first watch." He let his hand drop, taking a step backward to break the magnetic field that had suddenly flared between us. He was pulling away. He was going to walk out into the corridor, stand guard like a dutiful soldier, and leave me alone in the suffocating silence of my own empty mind. The thought of being alone right now, of being left with nothing but the questions about people I couldn't even remember, sent a spike of pure, unadulterated panic through me. Before he could take a second step, my body reacted. The same raw, unthinking instinct that had taught me how to disarm a guard now demanded an anchor to keep me from floating away into the dark. I reached out my fingers, wrapping tightly around his wrist. Antonio stopped dead, his muscles instantly going rigid under my grip. He looked down at my hand, then slowly brought his dark, assessing eyes back up to mine. "Sofia?" "Don't," I whispered fiercely. I didn't let him finish his statement. I didn't give him time to retreat behind his walls of duty and protocol. I stepped fully into his space, closing the distance between us in a single fluid motion. I slid my hand from his wrist up the corded muscle of his forearm until my fingers tangled in the damp, dark hair at the nape of his neck. I pulled him down as I rose onto my toes and pressed my lips to his. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was fueled by adrenaline, fear, and a desperate, clawing need to feel something real. My mouth crashed against his, hard and demanding. He tasted like expensive bourbon sea salt and a dark, dangerous kind of heat. For one agonizing second, Antonio was completely frozen. He was a statue carved from stone, his hands hovering rigidly in the air on either side of my waist, resisting the collision. But then I bit down gently on his lower lip, a brazen, feral challenge. With a low, ragged groan that sounded like a physical surrender, the statue shattered.
My mind raced. Every alarm bell in my head was screaming. She's Vincenzo's daughter. She has a traumatic brain injury. This is a lethal mistake. But the moment her mouth crashed against mine, the alarms were drowned out by a roaring wave of pure, unfiltered adrenaline. The girl, I remembered, the haughty, fragile princess who sneered at the world, would never have dared to touch me, let alone kiss me, like she was trying to steal the breath from my lungs. But the woman currently gripping my hair wasn't that girl. She was the survivor who had brought a chandelier down on a kill squad. She was wild, dangerous, and intoxicating. My hands, which had been hovering in the air trying to find the willpower to push her away, betrayed me. They dropped to her waist, my fingers gripping the soft fabric of the oversized sweatpants she wore. I pulled her flush against my chest, lifting her slightly off the floor. I kissed her back with all the pent-up frustration, terror, and dark fascination that had been building since I kicked down the door of her gilded cage. She let out a soft, sharp gasp against my mouth, her free hand coming up to grip the shirt at my shoulder. She met my intensity perfectly, parting her lips and inviting the invasion. The kiss deepened, turning chaotic and bruising. We were two people who had just spent the last hour dealing in death, suddenly desperate to prove we were still alive. I backed her up, my boots heavy on the concrete floor, until her spine hit the kitchen counter. The impact jarred her, and she broke the kiss with a ragged intake of breath. Her chest was heaving, her dark eyes were blown wide, pupils dilated, staring at me with a mix of shock and a blazing, unhidden hunger. Sanity, cold and unforgiving, finally pierced through the fog. In my brain, I released my grip on her waist, taking a staggering step backward, my own chest rising and falling heavily. I ran a shaking hand through my hair, turning my back to her for a split second to regain control of my fractured discipline. Damn it! I cursed under my breath, gripping the edge of the kitchen island. I turned back to face her. She was still, leaning against the counter, her lips swollen, watching me with a cautious, guarded expression. "We can't do this, Sofia," I said, my voice harsher than I intended, rough with restraint. "You don't even know who you are. You don't know who I am to you. I know that you saved my life." She countered, her chin tipping up in that familiar, stubborn angle. "And I know that I wanted to kiss you. Was I wrong? Yes. I lied, the word tasting like ash. You're confused. You're running on adrenaline and trauma. And I'm the man your father pays to do his dirty work. When you get your memory back, when you remember the life you actually have waiting for you, you're going to regret this." She pushed herself off the counter, stepping toward me again, entirely unfazed by my warning. The sheer lack of fear she had around me was staggering. "And if I never get it back?" she asked softly, her gaze dropping briefly to my mouth before snapping back to my eyes. "What if this is all there is? What if the princess is dead, Antonio?" Her words hit me like a physical blow, cutting straight to the terrifying truth of the situation. Vincenzo wanted his daughter back, but I was beginning to realize that the daughter he knew might have died in that car crash on the coastal highway. "Then heaven help us all," I murmured, my eyes tracing the fierce, beautiful lines of her face. I stepped back again, putting a definitive distance between us before my willpower snapped a second time. I couldn't be in the same room as her right now, not when the scent of her was overriding my common sense. "Lock your door," I ordered, my voice dropping back into the cold, authoritative cadence of a capo. "I'll be at the end of the hall. If you need anything, shout. Otherwise, try to sleep." I didn't wait for her to answer. I turned and walked out of the kitchenette, the echo of my heavy boots ringing in the concrete bunker. I took my position in a chair at the end of the long, dark corridor, my rifle resting across my knees. This house was impenetrable from the outside, but as I sat in the dark, my heart hammering a relentless rhythm against my ribs, I knew the real danger had already breached the perimeter. I'd been sent to rescue a hostage, but as I touched my fingers to my lips, still tasting the bourbon and the fire of her kiss, I realized I was the one in over my head. Sofia.
Sleep was an impossible concept. I had spent hours staring at the concrete ceiling of my assigned room, wrapped in the gray sheets, waiting for exhaustion to pull me under. But the moment I closed my eyes, the void in my head roared to life. It was a suffocating, echoing emptiness completely devoid of faces, names, or history. The only things that existed in the dark behind my eyelids were the terrifying flashes of recent violence. The sickening crunch of the guard's nose under my elbow, the weight of the Glock in my hands, the taste of Antonio's mouth. By the time the digital clock on the bedside table read 05 or I gave up. I rolled out of bed, leaving the oversized gray sweatpants on, but tying the drawstring tight so they sat securely on my hips. I kept the dark thermal Henley shirt pushing the sleeves up to my elbows. The deep cut on my bicep throbbed with a dull ache, but Mateo's stitches were holding perfectly. I picked up the stolen Glock from the nightstand, checking the safety, out of unthinking habit, and slipped out into the corridor. The bunker was tomb silent. The harsh fluorescent lights had been dimmed to a low standby hum. I walked barefoot down the concrete halls, letting my instincts guide me through the labyrinth of the safe house. My body was humming with a restless, frantic energy. I needed to move. I needed to understand what exactly I had been turned into. At the far end of the lowest level, I found it. The heavy steel doors were propped open, revealing an underground training facility. It smelled of old leather chalk powder and the metallic tang of iron. The floor was covered in dense black matting. Along one wall was a rack of free weights. Along the other, a row of heavy leather punching bags hung from thick steel chains. I walked over to a small wooden bench near the bags. Sitting on top of it was a roll of white athletic tape. My hands moved before my conscious mind even formulated a plan. I picked up the tape, anchored it to my right wrist, and began to rap. The movements were blindingly fast, precise, and entirely automated. Between the fingers across the knuckles, locking the thumb supporting the wrist. My hands knew the intricate geometry of violence intimately. Once both hands were wrapped, I stood in front of the heaviest bag. It was scarred and worn, bearing the marks of 1,000 beatings. I took a deep breath, dropping into a fighting stance. Jab, cross. The crack of my knuckles against the leather was sharp, echoing loudly in the empty room. Jab, cross, left hook, the bag swung the heavy chains, groaning in protest. I didn't stop. I fed the panic, the confusion, and the terrifying emptiness of my amnesia directly into my muscles. I threw combinations I didn't know the names of, pivoting on the balls of my feet with flawless balance. I brought my legs into the equation, delivering vicious roundhouse kicks that sent the massive bag slightly upward at sharp angles. My breath came in ragged gasps, sweat beading on my forehead, and plastering stray dark hairs to my face. The stitches in my arm pulled and burned, but I ignored the pain, chasing the absolute razor-sharp clarity that only existed in the center of the physical exertion. For the first time since waking up in Marco's bed, I didn't feel broken. I felt like a weapon operating at maximum efficiency. I delivered a brutal, spinning back kick, sinking my heel deep into the center of the leather. The bag flew backward on its chain, but before it could swing back into my strike zone, a large taped hand reached out from the shadows and caught it. The bag stopped dead.
I hadn't slept either. I was sitting in the dark of the comms room nursing a mug of battery acid bunker coffee when the rhythmic concussive thuds started echoing up through the ventilation shafts. It sounded like someone was taking a sledgehammer to the foundation. I followed the noise down to the basement level. I stopped in the doorway of the gym. The mug of coffee forgotten in my hand was completely mesmerized. Sofia was tearing the heavy bag apart. She moved with a lethal, terrifying grace. There was no hesitation, no wasted energy. Every strike was calculated to deliver maximum kinetic force. Vincenzo hadn't just taught her how to defend herself, he had hired masters to forge her into a close-quarters killing machine. I watched. The muscles in her back shift under the soft fabric of the Henley shirt, and watched the fierce, unyielding concentration on her face. The kiss from the kitchen flashed hot and bright in the back of my mind. The girl was a walking inferno, and I was standing entirely too close to the flames. When she launched a spinning back kick that nearly tore the bag off its heavy steel chain, I finally stepped out of the shadows and caught the leather, killing its momentum. Sofia spun instantly, dropping back into a defensive guard, her dark eyes flashing with feral intensity before registering who I was. "Your form is flawless," I said quietly, letting go of the bag and taking a step onto the mats. I was already wearing my tactical trousers and a dark t-shirt, with my own hands still wrapped in black tape from my session before the extraction. "But a heavy bag is just a bag, princess. It doesn't hit back." She slowly lowered her fists, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. The challenge in her eyes was instantaneous, bright and undeniable. "Are you offering?" "I think you need to know exactly what you're capable of so you don't underestimate yourself in the field," I replied, rolling my shoulders to loosen the tension in my back. "And I think you need to burn off some of that adrenaline before you tear the walls of this bunker down." "And what do you get out of it?" she asked, tilting her head. "I get to see if the boss's money was well spent." I lied. What I actually got was the dangerous, intoxicating excuse to lay my hands on her again. I stepped fully onto the mat, dropping into a loose, relaxed stance. I kept my hands open, inviting the attack. No strikes to the head and no joints. First one to tap or get pinned loses. Come on. She didn't give me a warning. She closed the distance with terrifying speed, throwing a lightning-fast jab-cross combination aimed squarely at my chest. I parried the jab and slipped the cross, but she was already pivoting, bringing a sweeping leg kick aimed at my ribs. I blocked it with my forearm, the impact sending a jarring shockwave up to my shoulder. Damn. She hit like a freight train. I didn't hold back. I fired back with a rapid sequence of body shots. She blocked the first two, slipped the third, and countered with a vicious elbow strike that I barely managed to deflect. The gym filled with the sharp percussive sounds of flesh striking flesh, the squeak of our bare feet on the mats and our ragged synchronizing breaths. It was a beautiful, brutal dance. She was faster, her strikes snapping like a whip, but I was heavier, using my mass to absorb her blows and control the center of the mat. I realized within 2 minutes that if I treated her like a fragile woman, she would put me in a coma. I had to fight her like an equal. She ducked under a wide hook I threw, stepping into my guard. She grabbed the collar of my t-shirt with her left hand, using her right arm to trap my extended arm, attempting to drop her weight and throw me over. Her hip in a textbook judo toss. She had the leverage, but I anticipated the shift in her center of gravity. As she dropped her hips to execute the throw, I hooked my leg behind her knee and used my weight to drive us both backward onto the mat.
The world tilted violently. My judo throw failed, expertly countered by Antonio's sheer size and tactical awareness. We hit the dense black mat with a heavy thud, the breath temporarily knocked from my lungs. In a fraction of a second, the sparring match transitioned into a desperate ground war. We grappled, limbs tangling as we fought for dominance. He tried to pin my shoulders. I violently bridged my hips, throwing him off balance and scrambling for a dominant position. But Antonio was a master on the ground. He caught my wrist as I reached for a choke, twisted his hips, and in one fluid, dominating motion flipped me onto my back. He pinned me to the mat. His heavy legs straddled my hips, locking me in place. He grabbed both of my taped wrists, pinning them against the black mat above my head with one massive hand, while his other hand came to rest heavily on my chest, right over my wildly beating heart. Checkmate. Antonio rasped his voice, rough and breathless. I thrashed underneath him for a second, my muscles burning, but his grip was like iron. He was completely immovable. I stopped fighting and going entirely still. The gym suddenly felt stripped of all its oxygen. The sounds of our violent sparring vanished, replaced entirely by the harsh, heavy sound of our breathing echoing in the quiet room. Antonio was hovering inches above me. His dark hair was disheveled, a fine sheen of sweat coating his skin. The cold, calculating mask of the capo was completely gone, replaced by something raw, hungry, and dangerously unfettered. I could feel the hard lines of his body pressed intimately against mine, the heat of his skin searing right through the fabric of my clothes. The physical combat had melted away, leaving only the thick, undeniable tension from the kitchenette in its wake. I looked up into his dark eyes, the adrenaline in my veins mutating back into that fierce, clawing desire. I wasn't scared that he had me pinned. I was thrilled by it. "You said first one to tap loses," I whispered, my voice incredibly soft in the quiet room. I didn't move my wrists to try and break his grip. I simply arched my back a fraction of an inch, pressing myself closer to him. Antonio's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering wildly near his temple. His eyes darkened to the color of pitch, dropping to my mouth before dragging slowly back up to meet my gaze. The hand resting on my chest slowly, almost involuntarily, slid upward, his rough taped fingers wrapping gently around the base of my throat. It wasn't a choke. It was a claim. Sofia. He breathed the word, sounding like a warning he was entirely incapable of enforcing. "I haven't tapped, Antonio," I murmured, staring up at him, my heart hammering a frantic, undeniable rhythm against his palm. "Have you?"
Sofia's whispered challenge hung between us, a match struck in a room filled with gasoline. My thumb was still resting against the frantic pulse at the base of her throat. Every instinct I possessed, every primal, irrational urge, was screaming at me to close the final fraction of an inch between us and show her exactly how far from tapping out I truly was. I leaned down, the heat of her breath hot across my lips. Then the concrete floor beneath us vibrated. It wasn't a subtle tremor. It was the deep mechanical groan of the house's primary blast doors engaging. A split second later, the deafening hiss of hydraulic pressure equalizing echoed down the corridors. No proximity alarms had sounded. No warning lights flashed. That meant whoever was opening the outer gates had used the master override code. There were only 2 people in the world who possessed that code: me and the Don. The spell shattered instantly. I ripped my hand away from her throat, rolling off her and springing to my feet in a single fluid motion. The intoxicating fog of desire vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, razor-sharp clarity of the capo. I grabbed my rifle from the bench, checked the chamber, and placed myself squarely between Sofia and the open doorway of the gym. "Get up," I ordered, my voice clipped and devoid of any emotion. Behind me. Sofia pushed herself off the mat, her eyes darting from my rigid posture to the hallway. I could see the emotional whiplash hit her, the sudden jarring transition from the man who was about to kiss her back into the ruthless soldier. She tightened the drawstring of her sweatpants and stepped into my shadow, her own body shifting instantly back into a defensive stance. Heavy, urgent footsteps echoed down the corridor. Multiple men. I kept my rifle lowered but ready. A second later, Luca appeared in the doorway, looking pale. He didn't even have time to announce the arrival before he was gently but firmly pushed aside by a mountain of a man in a charcoal overcoat. Vincenzo Valentino had arrived. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His silver hair was usually impeccably styled, but was windblown from the storm. The deep lines on his face were carved in stark relief, carrying the immense crushing weight of his empire. Behind him stood a phalanx of his elite personal guard, heavily armed and scanning the corners of the room. I instantly lowered the barrel of my weapon toward the floor and bowed my head slightly. "Boss, we didn't expect you until the highways were clear." Vincenzo didn't even look at me. His dark eyes bypassed me entirely, locking onto the woman standing just over my shoulder. When the Don of the Valentino family saw his daughter, the terrifying aura of the Mafia boss evaporated, leaving only a desperate, broken father in its wake.
The man filling the doorway was intimidating and radiating a kind of absolute authority that made the air in the room feel heavy. But the moment his eyes landed on me, that imposing facade crumbled. He let out a breath that sounded like a ragged sob while his broad shoulders dropped as if an invisible anvil had been lifted from them. "Sofia." He whispered the word, carrying a lifetime of profound, agonizing love. He bypassed Antonio, completely closing the distance between us in 3 long strides. He reached out his massive, trembling hands, gently framing my face. I stiffened, instinctively my muscles coiling to strike, but the sheer, overwhelming emotion radiating from him made me freeze. He didn't grab me like Marco had. He touched my cheeks as if I were made of spun glass, his thumbs carefully avoiding the white bandage on my temple. His dark eyes, that looked so much like the ones I had seen in my own reflection, were brimming with unshed tears. "My beautiful girl," Vincenzo murmured, pulling me into a crushing, desperate embrace. He buried his face in my hair, his massive frame shaking slightly. Thank God you are safe." When they found Carlo's car, I thought my world had ended. I stood perfectly rigid in his arms. I closed my eyes, digging into the deepest, darkest corners of my mind, begging for a spark. A memory of him reading to me as a child. A flash of a shared holiday. A feeling of safety. I wanted to feel the love this man was so clearly pouring into me. But there was nothing. Only a cold, echoing void. The cognitive dissonance was agonizing. My brain was completely silent, but my body, the body this man was currently holding, was buzzing with the muscle memory of the brutal, ruthless combat training he had subjected me to. He loved me. That much was undeniably written in the tears on his face. But he was also the one responsible for the monster inside me. Slowly, awkwardly, I brought my hands up and pressed them flat against his chest, gently but firmly pushing myself back. Vincenzo let me go immediately, though his hands hovered in the air as if he were afraid I might vanish into smoke. He searched my face, and his smile faltering as he registered the blank, guarded expression in my eyes. "Sofia?" he asked, his voice cracking. "What is it? Are you in pain?" I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat thick and heavy. I looked at Antonio, who was standing a few feet away, his face an unreadable mask of stone. I was entirely on my own. Looked back at the Don. "I'm sorry." I whispered the words, tasting bitter on my tongue. "I don't know who you are. Vincenzo flinched as if I had driven a knife directly between his ribs. The color drained from his weathered face. He looked at my bandaged forehead, then slowly lowered his hands. Antonio told me on the phone. Vincenzo said, his voice dropping to a devastated, hollow rasp. The doctor said it was amnesia from the crash, but to see it, to look at my own flesh and blood and see a stranger looking back at me. He turned away for a second, pinching the bridge of his nose as he fought a losing battle against his own grief. When he turned back, the raw sorrow in his eyes was almost too heavy to bear. I am your father, Sofia. Vincenzo said softly, his voice trembling with an underlying ferocity. My name is Vincenzo. Since the day your mother passed, you have been the absolute center of my universe. Every breath and every move I make in this city is to ensure you are safe. I countered the words spilling out before I could stop them. Is that why you turned me into a weapon? Vincenzo froze. He looked down at my hands still wrapped in the white athletic tape and then glanced at the heavy leather punching bag swinging lazily in the background. Because love is not enough to keep you alive in my world, Sofia. Vincenzo answered, the sorrow in his voice hardening into grim reality. I have enemies who would use you to break me. Ennio Rinaldi being the worst of them. If they thought you were just a fragile, innocent girl, they might never target you. But if they did, you could defend yourself. I had to make sure that if the wolves ever came to our door when I wasn't there, you could tear their throats out. He reached out again, gently wrapping his massive hand over my taped fist. I stripped away your normal life. I subjected you to years of grueling, brutal training in secret. Vincenzo confessed, his thumb tracing my knuckles. I did it because I loved you too much to ever let someone harm you. And yet the one thing I couldn't protect you from was a slick road in a thunderstorm. It saved your life, but couldn't save your mind. A strange, heavy ache bloomed in my chest. I still didn't remember him, but looking at the broken king standing before me, I finally understood the logic behind the madness. It wasn't cruelty. That had built my reflexes. It was a desperate, suffocating kind of love. So what do we do now? I asked quietly. Vincenzo straightened up, the vulnerability receding as the dawn took the mantle back over his shoulders. Now I take you home. Vincenzo declared, his eyes flashing with a dangerous protective fire. He looked over at his enforcer. Antonio, we do not wait for the storm to break. We have a convoy of armored vehicles waiting in the cavern. We move her to the primary compound immediately. She will be surrounded by our best men at all hours. Understood. Boss, Antonio replied instantly. Vincenzo turned back to me, offering a sad, determined smile. You may not remember me, Sofia, but I will spend every single day of the rest of my life proving to you who we are. Nobody will ever touch you again. As he led the way out of the gym, flanked by his massive guards. I lingered for a fraction of a second. I looked back at Antonio. The enforcer was watching me, his jaw tight, his dark eyes burning with the memory of what had almost happened on the mats just moments before the world crashed back in. I was going home to a castle I didn't remember, guarded by an army. I didn't know. But as I held Antonio's gaze, I realized that the only person in this entire empire who truly saw me for who I was now, the weapon, the survivor, the blank slate, was he the man who was paid to stand in my shadow?
The subterranean cavern beneath the safe house echoed with the low, guttural hum of 3 armored Mercedes SUVs idling on the concrete loading dock. I stood by the lead vehicle doing a final brass check of my rifle. The storm outside hadn't broken. If anything, the coastal winds were howling with renewed ferocity, whipping the ocean spray into the mouth of the cavern. It was atrocious weather for a drive, and even worse weather for a firefight, which made it perfect for a trap. Vincenzo stepped out of the freight elevator, the heavy charcoal fabric of his overcoat sweeping around his legs. Sofia walked a step behind him, dressed in the dark tactical clothing we had found for her, and the stolen Glock secured in a waistband holster at the small of her back. She moved with a guarded, predatory grace, her dark eyes scanning the cavern, analyzing the exits and the positioning of the guards. The highway is still hot, boss, I told Vincenzo as he approached. Ennio's men are locking down the northern pass. If we roll out now, they will spot the convoy. I know, Vincenzo replied. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that carried perfectly over the idling engines. His dark eyes were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of the sorrow that had broken him in the gym just an hour prior. The grieving father had vanished. The ruthless architect of the Valentino Empire had returned. We aren't sneaking out, Antonio. Vincenzo continued buttoning his overcoat. Ennio thinks he has us pinned. He thinks I am running scared with my wounded daughter. We are going to let him believe he has the upper hand right up until we break. His fingers, I caught on immediately. The convoy wasn't an escape attempt, it was bait. Alpha team is already in position on the ridges above the pass? I asked, with a feral smile threatening to pull at the corner of my mouth. Marco and his snipers have the high ground, Vincenzo confirmed. We drive the convoy straight into the teeth of the blockade. When Ennio's dogs step out to slaughter us, we wipe them off the face of the earth. We do not leave a single Rinaldi man breathing on that road. I gave a sharp nod. It was a massive risk to put Sofia in the center of the kill zone, but Vincenzo was a man who understood that true power required audacity. Ennio needed a decisive, crushing defeat to understand that touching the Valentino bloodline was a death sentence. I opened the heavy, reinforced rear door of the center SUV. Vincenzo gestured for Sofia to climb in first. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes locking onto mine. There was a silent, intense question in her gaze, a lingering ghost of the heat we had shared on the mats, but she masked it quickly, sliding into the leather interior. Vincenzo followed her, pulling the heavy door shut with a solid metallic thud. I climbed into the passenger seat of the lead SUV, pulling the door shut and keying my radio. All units, we are Oscar Mike, I commanded. We are walking into the Kai. Ambush. Keep your safety off and your eyes open. The massive steel gates of the cavern rolled open and the convoy plunged out into the freezing torrential rain. We snaked up the treacherous coastal highway, the headlights slicing through the sheets of rain. The road was a narrow ribbon of asphalt carved into the side of the cliffs. To our left was a sheer drop into the churning ocean. To our right, a steep, densely forested ridge. It was the perfect choke point. 3 miles into the drive, my radio crackled. Capo. Marco's voice whispered from his sniper perch somewhere in the invisible tree line above us. You have a roadblock ahead. 2 heavy transport trucks parked laterally across the lanes. Thermal shows 20 or maybe 25. Hostiles taking cover in the tree line on the right flank. They're armed with heavy ordnance, RPGs and light machine guns. Copy that, I said as my heart rate slowed down to a steady, icy rhythm. Hold your fire until they commit. We rounded a sharp bend, and there it was. The roadblock. The driver of my SUV slammed on the brakes, the heavy armored vehicle skidding on the slick asphalt before coming to a halt 50 yards from the barricade. The center SUV holding Vincenzo and Sofia stopped directly behind us, followed by the rear guard. 3 seconds there was only the sound of the rain hammering against the reinforced glass. Then the tree line erupted.
The interior of the armored SUV was suffocatingly quiet. I sat across from Vincenzo, the heavy leather seat smelling faintly of expensive cologne and gun oil. The Don was perfectly still, his hands resting on top of a silver-handled walking cane. His eyes fixed out the reinforced window. He didn't look like a man driving into an ambush. He looked like a king inspecting his lands. When the convoy abruptly slammed on its brakes, the momentum threw me forward against my seatbelt. Stay low, Sofia. Vincenzo ordered, his voice terrifyingly calm. A blinding flash of light illuminated the dark forest outside the window, followed instantly by a concussive roar that shook the massive vehicle to its chassis. An RPG rocket had detonated against the cliff face just 10 yards ahead of our lead car, showering the road with rock and debris. Immediately, the side of the SUV was hammered by heavy automatic gunfire. The armor-piercing rounds sparked and whined as they struck, the reinforced steel plating leaving deep spider-webbing craters in the bulletproof glass inches from my face. The sensory input was overwhelming. The deafening roar of the machine guns, the acrid, sulfurous smell of burning diesel and gunpowder seeping through the ventilation system, the violent rocking of the chassis, the high-pitched screech of tearing metal. My breath hitched. The air in my lungs suddenly turned to ice. The sounds and the smells didn't just trigger my adrenaline. They violently, aggressively tore a hole through the void in my mind. The present moment seemed to fracture the darkness behind my eyes, exploding into agonizing, blinding color. I wasn't in the center SUV anymore. I was in the back of a different car. The rain was drumming against the roof. The windshield wipers were slicing back and forth in a hypnotic rhythm. I was staring at a drop of water crawling down the glass. Then the world exploded, the terrifying weightlessness of the vehicle flipping. The deafening shatter of glass, the metallic taste of blood flooding my mouth, the world spinning violently out of control before slamming down into the embankment. I was hanging upside down, bound by the seatbelt. My head was screaming in agony. The smell of burning diesel and rain-soaked earth filled my nostrils. I turned my head. Carlo was in the passenger seat. The roof had caved in, pinning him. His neck was resting at an impossible angle, but he wasn't dead. He was choking on his own blood, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate terror that had nothing to do with the crash. He reached back with a trembling, shattered hand. His bloody fingers gripped my forearm with a strength that bruised the way. Bone. Princess. Carlo gasped, a wet rattling sound escaping his chest. I tried to speak to tell him help was coming, but I couldn't find the air. Listen to me. Carlo wheezed, his eyes burning into mine. It wasn't an accident. Rinaldi's men, they were waiting. They knew the route. A violent shudder racked his broken body. The darkness was closing in on the periphery of my vision, but Carlo's grip tightened, anchoring me to his final damning words. We were sold out, Sofia. He choked out, blood spilling past his lips. There is a rat in the house. Trust no one. His hand went limp, sliding off my arm. His eyes glazed over as the life left his body. The heavy boots crunched on the gravel outside, and the blinding light of a flashlight pierced the darkness of the wreckage before the boot collided with my head. Sofia. The memory shattered like a pane of glass. I gasped violently as my eyes snapped open. I was back in the center SUV. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, gripping the leather armrest so hard my knuckles were white. My chest was heaving, drawing in frantic, desperate breaths of the gunpowder-laced air. Outside the vehicle, the chaos of the ambush had radically shifted. The relentless hammering against our armor had stopped. Instead, the tree line was completely lit up by the muzzle flashes of Valentino snipers executing a flawless, devastating counterattack. Marco and his team on the ridge were raining pure hell down on the Rinaldi hit squad. Screams echoed over the roar of the storm as Ennio's men, realizing they had walked into a slaughterhouse, broke cover and tried to flee, only to be cut down by Antonio and the vanguard. Vincenzo was leaning forward, his massive hand resting on my knee, his face tight with concern. Sofia, look at me, Vincenzo commanded softly. Are you hit? Did a round penetrate? I stared at the Don, the man who had built me into a weapon, the man who loved me enough to turn my life into a cage. He was looking at me with pure, unfiltered terror for my safety, but Carlo's bloody, dying face was superimposed over his in my mind. There is a rat in the house. Trust no one. Someone had given Ennio my exact route on the night of the crash. Someone at the very top of the Valentino food chain. Someone who sat at Vincenzo's table, who knew his secrets, and who had tried to have me killed. I forced my breathing to slow down. I locked the terror away in a cold, dark box deep in my chest. My memory was still a vast wasteland, but this single horrific fragment had returned, and it gave me a lethal clarity. I'm fine. I lied smoothly, my voice cold and steady, the inflection of the master interrogator I supposedly was bleeding into my tone. I'm not hurt. The gunfire outside dwindled into sporadic single shots as Antonio's men moved through the tree line, executing the wounded and ensuring there were no survivors. The absolute destruction of the Rinaldi hit squad was complete. The heavy door of the SUV swung open, letting in a blast of freezing rain. Antonio stood in the frame, his rifle slung across his chest. His tactical gear was soaked and water was dripping from his dark hair. He looked like a god of war, a ruthless executioner returning to his king. But as his dark, intense eyes found mine in the dim light of the cabin, the coldness in his gaze softened just a fraction, searching my face. For any sign of injury? Looked at Antonio, the man who had carried me out of the fire, the man whose touch had ignited a dangerous, consuming fire in my veins. Did he know the route? I looked back at Vincenzo. Who did he trust? I was walking through a war zone. But as I touched the cold steel of the Glock at the small of my back, a new resolve hardened in my blood. I didn't need to remember everything to know how to hunt. I just needed to find the rat.
The armory in the lowest level of the safe house smelled of gun solvent. Vincenzo stood at the head of the heavy metal tactical table, a rolled-out blueprint of the east side docks, pinned flat beneath 2 spare magazines. His charcoal overcoat was gone, replaced by a dark suit jacket, but his eyes were pure, unfiltered murder. Ennio Rinaldi hadn't just tried to steal his daughter. He had forced Vincenzo to confront the terrifying reality that his training may have broken her. The Don wasn't going to retreat. He was going to amputate the offending limb of the Rinaldi empire. Ennio operates his primary smuggling ring out of Warehouse 4 at the East Side Port, Vincenzo growled, tapping a heavy gold ring against the blueprint. It's where he moves the untraceable cash, the heavy ordnance, and the narcotics. Without it, he can't pay his private army. Tonight we do not defend, we attack. We burn Warehouse 4 to the waterline and slaughter anyone wearing Ennio's colors. The port is a fortress, boss, Luca pointed out, studying the entry points. He'll have, at least 40 men heavily armed on the docks. Then bring 50 of ours, Vincenzo countered ruthlessly. I want to send a message so loud the entire eastern seaboard hears it. I'll lead the vanguard, I said, sliding a fresh magazine into my rifle and slapping it home with a satisfying clack. We approach by water, cut the power grid to the docks, and breach under the cover of the storm. It'll be a massacre. Good, Vincenzo said. Take the men and I'm coming with you. The voice was cold calm and brooked no argument. I spun around. Sofia was standing in the doorway of the armory. She was still wearing the dark thermal shirt and black tactical pants from the gym, but she had added a lightweight Kevlar vest over her chest. The stolen Glock was holstered at her hip, and her dark hair was pulled back into a tight, practical braid. She didn't look like a traumatized amnesiac. She looked like a predator ready for the hunt. Absolutely not. I snapped, taking a step toward her. The memory of her pinned beneath me on the mats flared violently in my chest, fueling a fierce, entirely unprofessional need to keep her locked in a reinforced box where nothing could ever touch her again. You are compromised, Sofia. Your memory is gone, and you caught a blade to the arm less than 6 hours ago. You are staying here under heavy guard. Sofia didn't even look at me. She kept her dark eyes locked entirely on her father. You built me to be a weapon, Vincenzo, she said, her voice eerily devoid of inflection. You said you did it to protect me from men like Ennio. Ennio took me. He tried to lock me in a basement. So if you are going to burn his empire down, I'm going to be there to strike the match. I looked at Vincenzo, expecting him to shut it down immediately. But the Don was staring at his daughter with a complex, agonizing mix of profound sorrow and dark pride. He was seeing the monster he had painstakingly created staring back at him with blank eyes. Boss, be reasonable, I urged, my voice dropping. If she freezes in a crossfire, she didn't freeze at Blackwood Point, did she? Vincenzo interrupted softly. He didn't look away from Sofia. She killed her captors and dropped a chandelier on a kill squad. That was pure survival instinct, I argued, my jaw clenching. A tactical raid is different. It's coordinated. It requires a killer. Antonio. Vincenzo cut me off, his tone final. He finally looked at me, and the command in his eyes was absolute. Take her. Keep her in your sight at all times. If the line breaks, you pull her out. But she fights. I stared at the Don furious, but my loyalty to the man superseded my anger. Understood. I turned back to Sofia. A smirk played on her lips, a fleeting, arrogant expression that reminded me violently of the princess I used to hate, though the danger behind it was entirely new. Stick to my shadow. I growled, grabbing a spare radio, earpiece from the table and tossing it to her. If you disobey a single order on that dock, I will throw you over my shoulder and carry you out myself. Sofia caught the earpiece flawlessly out of the air. I'd like to see you try, Antonio.
The rain was a relentless driving sheet of ice as the Zodiacs cut the engines, drifting silently toward the massive concrete pylons of the east side docks. The air smelled heavily of salt-rotting kelp and industrial diesel. My heart was beating, in a slow, steady rhythm. I was surrounded by men I didn't know, fighting for a family I couldn't remember, but the Glock in my hands felt like an extension of my own arm. The violent, chaotic world Antonio inhabited made perfect, terrifying sense to my muscles. Power grid goes dark in 3, 2, 1, Antonio murmured over the encrypted comms. A mile away, a Valentino operative blew the main transformer. The towering floodlights illuminating the shipping yard died instantly, plunging the entire port into absolute ink-black darkness. "Execute!" Antonio commanded. We swarmed up the metal ladders on the side of the docks like shadows. The Rinaldi guards were completely blind, shouting in confusion as their night vision was abruptly demanded but unavailable. Antonio's men didn't give them a chance to adjust. The silence of the storm was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic thwip-thwip of suppressed rifle fire. I moved with the vanguard, staying low, darting between the massive rust-stained shipping containers. My body took over completely. I didn't think about pulling the trigger. I simply reacted to targets. A guard stepped around a corner, raising a flashlight. Before the beam could fully illuminate my face, I raised the Glock, squeezed the trigger twice, and moved past him as he fell. It was a clinical, terrifyingly efficient slaughter. We pushed deep into the port, driving Ennio's remaining men toward the massive corrugated steel doors of Warehouse 4. The suppression was gone now. The firefight had gone entirely loud, echoing like thunder across the concrete. "Breach the doors!" Antonio roared, laying down heavy covering fire with his rifle. Luca slapped a block of C4 to the locking mechanism of the warehouse and blew it. The steel doors shrieked as they were blown inward. We poured into the cavernous space. It was a maze of wooden crates, pallets of shrink-wrapped cash, and heavy machinery. The remaining Rinaldi forces were scattering and abandoning their posts in a desperate bid to survive. Through the chaos, my eyes locked onto a figure sprinting up a metal catwalk toward a glass-enclosed supervisor's office. He was wearing a tailored suit entirely out of place among the dock workers and clutching a heavy metal briefcase to his chest. He was a high-value target. A capo. "Antonio Thurburn have a runner," I said into the comms, already breaking away from the main group. "Sofia, hold your position," Antonio barked back. I ignored him, my earpiece crackling with static. I sprinted toward the metal stairs, taking them 2 at a time. The capo reached the top landing, fumbling with his keys to unlock the office door. I didn't shout a warning. I raised the Glock and fired a single round, placing it perfectly through the meaty part of his left calf. The capo screamed, dropping the briefcase, and collapsed onto the metal grating of the catwalk. He scrambled backward, his hands slick with his own blood, leaving a dark smear on the steel as he backed against the glass wall of the office. I walked up the remaining steps, slowly keeping my weapon leveled at his chest. "Don't shoot!" the man begged, holding his hands up, his face pale and sweating. "I surrender. I'll give you the ledgers, the shipping routes, just don't kill me." I stepped under the flickering emergency light above the office door. The dim red glow washed over my face. The capo looked up at me. He blinked, his eyes widening in absolute, unadulterated horror. The fear of death was suddenly eclipsed by something far worse. He wasn't looking at a random Valentino soldier. He was looking at me. "No," he whispered, all the blood draining from his face. He pressed himself harder against the glass, trembling violently. "No, no, no. They said you were in a crash. They said you were brain dead." "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cold, stepping closer. Please. The man sobbed, tears actually streaming down his face. Please, Sofia. Don't put me back in the chair. I told you everything you wanted to know last time. I swear to God. The world stopped. The sounds of the firefight below faded into a distant, muffled hum. The smell of the damp warehouse, the flickering red light, and the absolute, abject terror in the man's eyes violently aligned with something buried deep in the void of my mind. I wasn't standing on a catwalk. I was sitting in a windowless, soundproof room beneath the Valentino compound. The walls were cold gray concrete. A single harsh halogen light hung from the ceiling, illuminating a heavy metal table. Strapped to a chair across from me was this exact man. Dante, a Rinaldi lieutenant. He was bleeding from a broken nose, begging for mercy just as he was now. I was sitting casually in a leather chair, my legs crossed, sipping a cup of black espresso. I wasn't wearing tactical gear. I was wearing a pristine white silk blouse. My hands were clean. You're lying to me, Dante. My own voice echoed in my head. Cold, detached, and utterly devoid of empathy. And you know I detest repeating myself. Let's try this again. Where is Ennio moving the shipment from Bogota? Dante spat a curse at me. I didn't flinch. I set the espresso cup down with deliberate slowness. I stood up, picked up a pair of heavy surgical steel pliers from a metal tray, and walked around. The table. I can keep you alive and in excruciating pain for 3 days, Dante. The memory of my own voice whispered, chilling me to the bone. Or you can tell me the truth and I will let you sleep. The choice is entirely yours. Dante began to scream as I raised the pliers. The memory shattered, snapping me violently back to the present. I gasped, staggering backward on the catwalk. The Glock wavered in my hand. I stared at the bleeding man cowering before me. Heavy boots pounded up the metal stairs behind me. Sofia! Antonio crested the landing, his rifle raised. He swept the catwalk, assessing the bleeding capo, and then his eyes locked onto me. He saw the pale, horrified shock on my face. Are you hit? Antonio demanded, stepping in front of me, shielding my body with his own. I looked at Antonio's broad back then, past him to the terrified capo on the floor. No. I whispered the word, sounding hollow and strange in my own ears. Antonio turned to look at me, his dark brows furrowing. Then what? Is it? What happened? I lowered the gun, my hands trembling as the horrifying weight of my true identity settled like a stone in my chest. I looked up into Antonio's eyes, seeing the man who had kissed me, the man who thought I was just a physical weapon who had survived a crash. I remember him. I said, my voice completely devoid of the warmth I had felt in the gym. I looked back, down at the terrified capo, and the panic I had felt since waking up in Marco's bed finally permanently dissolved. It was replaced by a terrifying, icy control. Get him up, Antonio. I ordered, my voice ringing with absolute ruthless authority. Bind his hands. He's coming back to the safe house with us. I have a few more questions for him, and this time, he's going to tell me exactly who sold me out on the highway.
The soundproof interrogation room beneath the safe house was a sensory deprivation chamber. Gray concrete walls. A single steel table bolted to the floor. The air was frigid, smelling faintly of bleach and old copper. Dante was strapped into the heavy steel chair at the center of the room. A field dressing was wrapped tightly around his bleeding calf, but he was shivering violently, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy metal door. I stood in the corner, shrouded in the shadows, my arms crossed over my chest. The door opened, with a heavy metallic groan. Sofia walked in. She had stripped off the tactical vest and the holster. She was wearing only the dark thermal shirt and black pants, her hair pulled back in a neat, merciless braid. She didn't carry a weapon. She didn't need one. She walked to the metal table, pulling out the single chair opposite Dante, and sat down. She crossed her legs, leaning back, her face a mask of absolute, terrifying serenity. Hello, Dante, Sofia said, her voice soft, cultured, and chillingly devoid of emotion. Sofia, please, Dante choked out, straining against the heavy leather, straps binding his wrists. I didn't know Marco was going to take you. I just handled the shipping. Ennio kept the kidnapping quiet. I believe you, Sofia replied smoothly. She rested her elbows on the table, steepling her fingers. I'm not here to ask you about Marco. I'm here to ask you about the night of the crash. Dante swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. My father's convoy routes are encrypted. Sofia continued, her dark eyes locking onto his with predatory focus. Only the inner circle has access. Yet your men were waiting on the coastal highway in a thunderstorm. Someone handed Ennio my schedule. Someone wanted me dead. I don't know the names, I swear, Dante stammered, sweat pouring down his pale face. Sofia sighed, a quiet sound of profound disappointment. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten him with pliers this time. She simply let the silence stretch heavy and suffocating until the sheer weight of her reputation crushed the remaining air from Dante's lungs. I watched her from the shadows, entirely captivated. The cognitive dissonance was gone. The fragile princess I had hated was a phantom. The woman sitting at that table was a queen carved from ice and steel. She was ruthless, brilliant, and completely terrifying. And heaven help me, I had never wanted anyone more in my entire life. Dante. Sofia. Whispered, leaning forward just an inch. If you make me ask you a third time, I will not ask you a fourth. Who is the rat? Dante broke. A sob tore from his throat. It was Silvio, Vincenzo's lieutenant. He met with Ennio 3 weeks ago. Ennio promised him the East Side ports and Antonio's position as capo if he helped remove you from the board. Silvio wanted Vincenzo to bleed so the underbosses would lose faith in him. He gave us the route, Silvio. The hothead who had demanded we go to war in the study. The man who had been sitting at Vincenzo's right hand for 5 years. Sofia stood up, her face completely unreadable. She looked at me standing in the shadows. The clinical interrogator mask slipped just a fraction, revealing the fierce burning fire of a daughter betrayed. Did you get that, Antonio? She asked. I got it. I growled, pushing off the concrete wall, my hand already dropping to the heavy pistol at my thigh. Let's go clean house.
We didn't go to Vincenzo first. A rat backed into a corner was the most dangerous kind of animal, and if we warned the Don, Silvio would sense the shift in the wind and run. We found him in the safe house's secondary comms room on the upper level. He was pacing in front of the radio monitors, his face tight with stress, undoubtedly waiting for word on the port raid that we had just annihilated. When Antonio and I walked through the door, Silvio froze. Antonio, Silvio barked, trying to mask his panic with false authority. You're back early. Did you secure the port? Warehouse 4 is ashes. Antonio said, his voice a low, lethal rumble. He closed the heavy door behind us, locking the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. And Dante is singing a very interesting song in the basement. All the color drained from Silvio's face. His eyes darted from Antonio to me, registering the cold, dead focus in my gaze. He knew he was caught. He's a liar. Silvio stammered, taking a slow step backward toward the console. Ennio's men will say anything to tear us apart from the inside, Antonio. You know this. He knew details about the convoy route only you and my father had, Silvio. I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the small room. You sold out my detail. You got Carlo killed. Silvio's facade shattered. With a snarl of pure desperation, his hand darted beneath his suit jacket, drawing a concealed weapon. He never even managed to aim it. Antonio and I moved in perfect lethal synchronization, two halves of a single devastating weapon. I didn't draw my gun. I stepped into Silvio's guard, executing a flawless, blindingly fast disarm. I caught his wrist, twisting it sharply outward until the bone popped, forcing his hand to open. The gun clattered to the floor. As Silvio screamed, I used his own momentum to throw him off balance, driving my knee violently into his solar plexus. Silvio doubled over, gasping for air, but before he could hit the floor, Antonio was there. Antonio grabbed the traitor by the lapels of his expensive suit, slamming him brutally against the concrete wall. The impact knocked the remaining breath from Silvio's lungs. Antonio drew his sidearm and pressed the barrel directly beneath Silvio's chin. Give me one reason why I shouldn't paint this wall with you. Antonio snarled. The door to the comms room suddenly swung open, the deadbolt shattered by a heavy kick. Vincenzo stood in the doorway flanked by his guards. He looked at the scene, his trusted lieutenant pinned to the wall by his enforcer, and his daughter standing over a dropped weapon, her stance flawless and unbroken. Because he is mine to punish Antonio. Vincenzo said, his voice a terrifying, quiet rasp. Antonio held the gun steady for a fraction of a second, his eyes locking with mine. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. Antonio lowered the weapon, stepping back, and letting Silvio slump to the floor, coughing up blood. Vincenzo walked into the room. He didn't look at the traitor groveling at his feet. He looked at me. He saw the coldness, the capability, and the absolute lack of fear. The father who had tried to keep his daughter in a gilded cage finally realized the cage had burned down. Take him to the basement, Vincenzo ordered his guards, his eyes never leaving mine. And make sure he understands exactly what it costs to betray my blood. As the guards dragged a screaming Silvio from the room, Vincenzo stepped closer to me. You remember, Vincenzo said softly, a statement rather than a question. Not everything. I answered truthfully, the adrenaline finally starting to recede. I don't remember my childhood. I don't remember my mother. But I remember who I am in the dark, Vincenzo. I know what you made me. Vincenzo bowed his head, this weight of his empire seemingly crushing his shoulders. I made you a survivor, and for that, I will never apologize. But you are no longer a secret, Sofia. Ennio is crippled, but the war is not over. You will always be in danger. I looked past my father to Antonio. The enforcer was watching me, his dark eyes burning with that familiar, intense heat. I wasn't a fragile princess anymore, and I wasn't just a mindless weapon. I was Sofia Valentino. Sophie. Family will have me. I told Vincenzo, stepping past him to stand beside Antonio. But from now on, I don't fight in the shadows. I fight on the front lines, and I don't take orders from anyone but myself. Vincenzo looked at the two of us standing, shoulder to shoulder. A slow, fierce smile spread across the Don's face. Understood. The storm finally broke 2 days later. The morning sun broke through the heavy, bruised clouds, casting brilliant rays of gold across the crashing surf at the base of the Valentino estate. I was standing on the grand balcony of my bedroom, cup of black coffee warming my hands. The last 48 hours had been a blur of tactical strikes and brutal negotiations. Ennio Rinaldi stripped of his port, and his best capos had vied for peace. Vincenzo had accepted demanding a king's ransom in territory and blood. The war was over, won by the very weapon the enemy had tried to steal. My memory was still fractured. Entire years of my life were blank pages, but I was no longer terrified of the void. I was filling the pages with new ink. The heavy glass door of the balcony slid open. Antonio stepped out into the morning light. He wasn't wearing his tactical gear. He was dressed in dark jeans and a simple black t-shirt, looking impossibly broad, and entirely out of place among the imported marble and silk curtains of my room. The perimeter is secure. Antonio rumbled, stepping up to the stone balustrade beside me. Ennio's remaining men have completely pulled out of the northern sector. Your father is officially the undisputed king of the coast. And what does that make you? I asked, looking sideways at him. Antonio rested his forearms on the stone, looking out at the ocean. It makes me a man who needs a vacation. I let out, a soft laugh, the sound surprising me. It felt genuine. It felt real. I set my coffee cup down on a small wrought iron table and turned to face him completely. The cold clinical mask was gone, locked away until the family needed her again. Now there was only the fierce burning tension that had been crackling between us since the mats in the safe house gym. I told Vincenzo I wasn't going back into the cage. I said quietly. I know, Antonio replied, finally turning his dark eyes to meet mine. He appointed you as his chief strategist. You're officially on the board, princess. Don't call me that, I murmured, stepping closer, invading his personal space. Force of habit. Antonio countered, though he didn't back away. The muscle in his jaw feathered his gaze, dropping to my mouth. It's hard to reconcile the woman standing in front of me with the girl who used to yell at the staff for bringing her the wrong vintage of champagne. That girl is dead, Antonio, I said, reaching out. My hand, still bearing the faint bruises from the fighting, rested flat against the heavy muscle of his chest. I could feel his heart hammering a frantic, undeniable rhythm beneath my palm. She died in the crash. The woman who walked out of that wreckage knows exactly what she wants. Antonio sucked in a sharp breath. The ironclad control of the capo finally permanently snapped. He didn't hesitate this time. He reached out, his massive hands gripping my waist, pulling me flush against his body. He backed me up until my spine hit the cool stone of the balustrade, trapping me completely in the best possible way. Are you sure? Antonio growled, his face inches from mine, his voice a dark, rough warning. Because if we do this, Sofia, there is no going back. I am not a gentleman, and I will not share you. I don't want gentle, I whispered fiercely, sliding my hands up to tangle in his dark hair. I want you. Antonio crushed his mouth against mine. It was a kiss forged in gunpowder and adrenaline. There was no hesitation, no holding back. It was consuming, desperate, and perfect. I kissed him back with every ounce of the fierce, feral energy that Vincenzo had programmed into me, claiming the enforcer as completely as he was claiming me. We were both monsters born in the dark, weapons forged for a violent world. But as Antonio lifted me slightly, wrapping me in an embrace that felt completely impenetrable, I realized I didn't care about the memories I had lost. I had found exactly where I belonged. Epilogue. 1 year later. The grand ballroom of the Valentino estate was bathed in the warm golden light of crystal chandeliers. A string quartet played softly in the corner, nearly drowned out by the clinking of champagne flutes and the low, murmuring laughter of the city's most powerful elite. I stood at the top of the sweeping marble staircase, looking down at the empire my father built. I was wearing a floor-length gown of burgundy red silk, a slit cut daringly high up the thigh to allow for a full range of motion. A diamond necklace rested against my collarbone, catching the light with every breath. To the politicians, the judges, and the rival bosses mingling below, I looked like the perfect, untouched Mafia princess, returning to society after a long, tragic illness. But the men who truly mattered, the capos, the lieutenants, the soldiers, standing guard at the perimeter, all knew the truth. They knew the diamond necklace was hiding a faint silvery scar. They knew the heavy silk of my gown concealed a custom-fitted tactical holster strapped to my thigh. And they knew that when Vincenzo Valentino eventually stepped down, the throne wouldn't pass to a husband. It would pass to me. I felt the shift in the air a fraction of a second before I felt the heat of him at my back. Antonio stepped up beside me, materializing from the shadows like he always did. He was wearing a bespoke black tuxedo that fit his massive frame flawlessly, though he looked like a wolf forced into a velvet collar. The silver pin of the underboss gleamed on his lapel, the position Vincenzo had rightfully given him after Silvio's betrayal. You look bored, Mia Regina. Antonio murmured, his voice a low rumble meant only for me. He rested his hand on the small of my back, his thumb tracing a possessive grounding circle against my spine. Just calculating, I replied, leaning into his touch. I took a sip of my champagne, my eyes tracking a specific man near the bar. A newly minted boss from the Northern Territories who had been getting a little too ambitious with his shipping routes. Rossi brought 3 armed men into the foyer. He told the guards they were unarmed. Antonio's dark eyes tracked my gaze, instantly shifting from my lover back into the apex predator of the Valentino family. Luca already relieved them of their weapons at the coat check. Rossi is going to have a very uncomfortable meeting with your father in the study tonight. Not with my father, I corrected smoothly, handing my half-empty champagne glass to a passing waiter. Vincenzo is retiring for the evening. I'm taking the meeting. A slow, wicked smile spread across Antonio's face. It was a smile that would have terrified the men on the floor below, but to me it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Do you want me in the room? he asked. I want you standing right behind my chair, I said, turning to face him. I looked up into the dark eyes of the man who had pulled me from the fire. The amnesia had never faded. The first 24 years of my life remained a complete, impenetrable blank. I had no childhood memories, no sweet nostalgia to fall back on. But as Antonio reached up his rough fingers, gently tucking a stray curl behind my ear, I realized I had never once mourned the loss of the old Sofia. She was a ghost who had lived. In a cage? I was alive. I was lethal. And I was exactly where I was meant to be. Let's go remind Mr. Rossi who owns this city, Antonio murmured, offering me his arm. I didn't take his arm. Instead, I intertwined my fingers with his palms pressing perfectly together, the calluses of the enforcer meeting the calluses of the inquisitor. Let's, I agreed. Together we descended the marble staircase, stepping out of the shadows and into the light. The string quartet played on the champagne flowed, and as the crowd parted in absolute terrified respect, the new era of the Valentino Empire officially began.